Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining on this lovely spring evening. We're about to get started. I hope you all enjoyed your meals. Uh, Louder. Okay. If any of you can't hear me or any of the other speakers at any point, just give us a shout. Uh, It's great to be here. My name is Mark Walmsley. I'm from Kestrel Land Trust, and I am absolutely thrilled to have been invited by the town of Southampton to be both a presenter and a moderator tonight and at the next workshop that's going to be had in a couple weeks. So for better or worse, you're going to get a double dose of me tonight and then. But I just want to start out with a few thank yous this evening. The first one going to the Southampton Open Space Committee for organizing this, and to one person in particular, Diana Fetterman, who did just yeoman's work in pulling this all together and organizing. It was not an easy task, and she really put together a wonderful slate of events. We also need to thank Diana for just being a wonderful grant writer for the town of Southampton. Working with Kestrel and other members of the town, she was able to pull in around over $600,000 for land conservation in the last 2 years. And I can say I really relied on her skill and her writing ability in those grant applications. She really made the projects come to life, I think, from someone only from the perspective of someone who lives in the town could do. So very great thank you to Diana. We also want to give a hearty thanks to Laura Hudson, the chef extraordinaire of the evening. As well as her team, Danette Green, Kate Cooper, Lori Mays, and Allison Wondriska, who all put the dinner together for this evening. And then a few other folks. This is just a lovely space. I've actually never been here to present. I think it's perfect for the evening. So we want to thank Jim Belisle, the church sexton, and Reverend Jenny Valentine, who both worked hard to make this evening a success. To Megan Gentile for tech support. She's going to be around this evening in case we have any glitches, and she helped set everything up. And for Easthampton Media for recording the event tonight. So thanks to everybody. I think it should be a fun and informative evening. We have a really good slate of speakers, I believe. A few small technical things just to begin with as well. After that wonderful dinner, restrooms are down the hall. Also, we decided to put the meeting together to hold questions to the end, and I think they're going to be in the form of written questions. So there should be index cards on everyone's tables. Hopefully you have pens as well. If you don't, just let us know and we'll get them to you. So you can write out questions to us as each of the presenters speak tonight and then hand them in. Folks will be around to collect them. And I'll stress right now, I have no idea how much time we'll have at the end, but if we don't get to your question, please feel free to come up to one of the presenters and ask. We'll all be hanging around a little bit after the presentation tonight, and I can provide my contact information. We definitely want to get to everybody. Let's see. And also at the end, I was reminded we're asking people to complete evaluations, because again, this was a grant-funded event. So it will really show the hard work that people put into it to bring the meeting together if you fill out those evaluations. So all that being said, I'm going to start out with what I hope is a relatively easy question for all of you. Raise your hand if you like where you live. Either your property, your neighborhood, your town. If you like where you live, raise your hand. Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot for why, because I have an idea. Because I have had the honor over the last couple of years in working on projects with Southampton to read through a lot of the town's planning documents, including the master plan, the open space plan, and residents who give public input to those plans consistently identify open land as being important to them. And that's really the reason why we're here tonight, to talk about conservation. Because residents, and in particular landowners, are really in charge of how this town is going to look, feel, and function in the future. It's really up to you. Your options, and knowing your options and your decisions right now are really going to matter, both now and into the future. So that's why we're here tonight, myself and my presenters, We've realized for quite some time, folks who work in the conservation community, that the options that landowners have in regards to conservation aren't really well known. If you want to sell your land, you know to go to. If you want to build a house in your land, you know who to go to. A lot of people don't necessarily know, number one, what their conservation options are or who to go to. So a lot of municipalities reach out to conservation professionals and ask for presentations like this, and we find them very, very valuable. So I'm going to start off with just the idea of conservation. What are we talking about here? Because the word conservation has a few different meanings, but all of them start with the idea that undeveloped land has its own values, often called natural resources, a term we all know. And those natural resources often benefit the landowner as well as the broader community as well. And once those natural resources are identified, either by the landowner saying, I really value the pond on my property, or by a municipality saying, this is the agricultural area of town. It always has been. That's where the best farm soils are. We want to call this out as an area where we want to put some conservation effort and some conservation funding. Or all the way up to the state or federal level saying this is an important area for wildlife connectivity, or these are the most important forest resources. Once those natural resources are identified, they can be managed by the landowner in a way that sustains them into the future. Or they could even be protected legally to ensure that the resources aren't diminished, either by current users or by users who might own the land in years to come. So tonight's program is really shaped by the idea that both landowners and communities often share interests in conserving natural resources. And both have some unique tools and mechanisms at their disposal to do so. And very often those public and private interests can and do work together for conservation projects. So the landowner wants to conserve something on their land, there's often a program or an organization out there willing to help them with that conservation project. So we have a number of people speaking tonight. We have representatives from both private entities, land trusts, as well as municipal, people talk about municipal and state programs, which evaluate natural resources and how they may be important to protect, as well as the incentives that they can offer to landowners to consider conservation as their option, or as an option. And really importantly, we also have two landowners who I know who have conserved land in the past to talk about what their experiences were actually like on the ground. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Hopefully it's mostly good, but I mean, these are sometimes complicated projects, so their insight is always incredibly valuable. We learn from them, and we hope you'll learn from them too. So I'm going to give just a brief introduction to land conservation from a land trust perspective. So I'll start out as the presenter, and then I'll talk a little bit more about Kestrel Land Trust, for which I work, and kind of our interests in conservation, and why different land trusts and different organizations might have different conservation interests should be clear soon. Now comes the tech part of the presentation, where I have to switch presentations. Oh. Ah. Be right there. Okay. Yeah, let's just make sure we get this view slideshow. Beginning, start slideshow. Yeah, can you get that one going? Just so it was showing, okay. It's showing well. No, that's okay. We're good. So, just to begin, I mean, who of you knows what a land trust is or think you knows what a land trust is? A couple people have heard. Land trusts are private organizations dedicated to protecting land in perpetuity. So usually that's our aim, to protect land in perpetuity, which is forever, either by owning land or holding an easement called a conservation restriction on land. We'll get into what a conservation restriction is in a little bit, and just to confuse you a little more, we are the only state that calls them conservation restrictions. Everyone else in the country calls them conservation easements. Massachusetts just likes to be different. So again, we're interested in legally protect. Why isn't this showing? Okay, I guess I do need a technical. Yeah, what's going on there? This is why we keep a tech person around. Oh, maybe it's because it's not active. Is that the issue?
Can we restart yours?
Sure. There we go. Okay, thank you very, very much. Okay, so these are just some of the things that I started by saying. Legally protecting land's natural resource values, accomplished when a conservation organization, or agency either requires the land or requires specific rights to the land. So basically, that's how we operate, and protection in perpetuity. I like this slide for one reason. Number one, it's local, and it reminds us actually that most people don't know that the conservation movement not only has deep roots in Massachusetts, it actually has very deep roots right here in the Pioneer Valley. This is one of the first places in the world where people started really looking at land, particularly undeveloped land, as something other than wild spaces that you should be scared of. Although this isn't the painting, I mean, there's a famous painting of the Oxbow by Thomas Cole. And that was really the start of the movement of land conservation in the United States. And not surprisingly, arguably the first land trust in the world actually also started in Massachusetts. Does anyone know what that land trust might be? Yes, the Trustees of Reservations started all the way back in 1891, started in Massachusetts. So we have been running from that great start ever since. Land trust. Massachusetts actually has the highest number of land trusts of any state in the country, I believe. And we've done a lot of work both here and across the nation. A lot of us are accredited through the Land Trust Alliance. There's also a local Mass Land Trust Coalition, which kind of helps coordinate our efforts and deal with different issues. But let's see here. At its essence, land conservation projects for a land trust is really a real estate transaction. Though it's a special type of real estate transaction that has some unique elements to it and often its own time frame. So again, my presentation is going to be split between tonight and another workshop, so I'm not going to get too much into the mechanics of land conservation, but more kind of generally what we do, what land trust interests are, and how people value land. But I just wanted to give a brief introduction to this of how land conservation does happen, how a land conservation project does happen, just in general. And these are generally how they're approached. Conservation restrictions can be donated or purchased from a landowner. Land can be purchased or donated from a landowner to a land trust or any other conservation organization. There are things called bargain sales, where landowners might, say, well, I'd like to get some money back from the land, but I don't need the full appraised value of it. I'd like to maybe get a tax benefit for a partial donation and a partial sale. There are bequests. People can leave land and other other assets to conservation organizations. There are things called reserved life estates, where people basically sell off the land but reserve some right to remain on the land. And I should also say that a conservation restriction Again, we won't be getting into depth here. That again is a conservation easement. That is one where you basically sell the development rights to your land, but retain actual ownership of the land yourself, including often the right to live on the land. And limited development is also another interesting conservation option that a lot of people don't know about. We actually work with a lot of projects where a landowner comes to us and says, for one reason or another, we want to carve out a bit of land to build a house on, either for the value in that, or say, we want to reserve some land for our children to move back into the area, but would love to conserve this other area. And that can often be worked into a conservation project. It actually is very, very common. So there's a lot of flexibility possible in land conservation. But I'd say the first starting step for any land conservation project, it really starts with a willing landowner. That's how land trusts work. That's our model of operation. That's why we help in events like this and just kind of getting out information to people. And I often say that a land conservation project is like a puzzle, which is why I include this stonework picture in there. It's putting pieces together. So on the one hand, you have a landowner, and the landowner has goals, either for what they want to see their land to become or what they want to protect on their land. It might be goals for monetary reimbursement they want to get from protecting their land. So that's one puzzle piece. And then you have a conservation organization or agency. It could be a government agency. And there are many of us out there, and they're all different, or we're all different. We all want to protect different things. If you're talking to Mass Audubon, they're looking for properties that are important for birds or next to their sanctuaries. Different land trusts, different state agencies, be it DCR or Fish and Wildlife, they're all looking to protect different things. So that's another puzzle piece. What's the right partner organization? And then there's funding very often, unless it's a straight donation. If you're talking about buying land or buying the development rights to land in a conservation restriction, you need to find a funding source. Now, I wish land trusts were just sitting on a giant pot of money and they could protect the land that they wanted to, but that's just not the way we operate. All our staff costs basically are paid by donations. So we become experts at finding money or knowing tax incentives that can help landowners. And those are often grants, either government grants or through private foundations. And then there's time. That's the last puzzle piece that we must bring together. Land conservation very rarely happens as quickly as a normal real estate transaction does. There are a few exceptions that prove the rule, but it's not often. Why? Because there's a lot of different options for landowners to consider. They need often to mull those over. And also in relation to funding, you're trying to bring in outside funding, often from a grant. Those grants usually have their own timelines. They have their own deadlines during the year, then you have to wait to get back to them. So it can take easily a year and a half to protect land if everything goes well. I joke when I started my position, one of the most, recent successes in Southampton on Cooking County Road. A lot of people know the property out there that we protected a few years ago. When I first got that file, I realized that it was actually then the town of Easthampton, first contacted the landowner in 1989. And the seed was planted, and it took that time to germinate. The family wasn't ready then, but they knew that there was a conservation partner interested, and it was particularly for water supply protection. Their land, that's the natural resource that was identified on that land. So it took time to get there, but luckily, there was an organization willing to pick up the ball when the family was interested. So how do land trusts and other organizations identify what natural resources are important to them? Obviously, we all have our own missions. But I think this is an important thing that I like to get out there, is that land trusts and other conservation groups don't protect land willy-nilly. We don't have the resources to do that, either in terms of the funding or the staff time. We rely on a lot of direction, be it from a community coming to us and saying, this area or this land is really important to us. We also rely a lot on the scientific community. There's a lot of data out there, and Massachusetts is particularly blessed. A lot of data comes out from UMass, as well as from the state, where we can map out different conservation values. So for instance, this map here shows Kestrel's working area, which is currently around 19 towns. And the dark kind of red salmony areas are prime farmland soils. And there are other soils or farm soils of statewide importance. So when we're talking about what are our goals for farmland protection, where we be working, we map it. We map those natural resource values out, and we identify areas where we want to work. And like I said before, where there's an opportunity for, very often an opportunity for a private landowner to work with a partner organization, prime and statewide important farm soils are one of the main criteria for getting involved in the state's agricultural preservation restriction program. That's one of the main criteria. So that's kind of how those works together. Map out, identify important natural resources to protect, what are the priorities, and then find the program to make it happen. So I always like to include this particular slide, which is kind of give a graphic of one particular conservation project. This is basically shows an actual project. And I think it's really important because it shows kind of how flexible conservation can be and also kind of how complex it can be. So we're talking about a family here, the Riley family, who owned 280 acres of land. And they came to someone and said, we want to protect it. What's the best idea here? So if you look at the kind of mustard colors area, that was the original family homestead. There was a house there. So they wanted that pulled out from the conservation project. They also said, well, we want to carve out some house lots, like I said before, for our kids if they ever want to come back. So the land trust they were working with said, yeah, okay, where's the best place for those? So those lighter green areas were carved out as house lots. Another interesting thing, when we mapped out the land, or when the land trust mapped out the land, they realized that over to the upper right-hand corner was already state conservation land. So the land trust contacted the state, and the state said, yeah, would be interested in acquiring some of that land in fee, which actually buying the land outright, and we have money to do it. So they sold a number, I think it was 80 acres there, to the state and got money back. And then they donated a conservation restriction on the remaining 188 acres and received tax benefits. So it shows you the opportunities that can be had, but also the complexity and the time that can go into a land conservation project. But it also shows why it's really a good idea to, if you're interested in conservation, to sit down and have a conversation with someone. We kind of know how these things work, and we get very creative in making landowners happy and helping landowners achieve their goals. So I just wanted to get in a little bit about Kestrel Land Trust, because we are one of the primary land trusts working in this area right now. So basically, we sit down, we want to preserve the valley and what makes up the valley. I think we could all guess. Forests, farms, riverways, as well as we consider an important part of our mission to really nurture an enduring love of the land with people, to keep maintaining public access for people on land where it's feasible, because people aren't going to want to protect land unless they love it. And it's really easy to fall in love with a piece of property the more you get out there. We were founded in 1970. We're about to have our 50th coming up very soon, and to conserve more than 25,000 acres. We generally aim to conserve around 1,000 acres in the valley a year. We just think that's our staff capacity and the funding that's out there, and there's definitely more than enough land to try and do that. Again, our service area, we generally serve 19 towns. So why does Kestrel Land Trust conserve land? Well, one of the first things that when someone comes to us with a property, public recreation, obviously. A lot of times state agencies or towns come to us when it comes to public recreation. It's often not as much private landowners, but often towns come to us saying, hey, look, we need someone to move quickly on a property. It's adjacent to a park, or we want to become a new park. Can you help? Wildlife habitat. I mean, obviously, it's one of the main natural resource values of land here. We have all of these in abundance in the area, and a lot of them require large amounts of forest land. Kestrel just acquired a 349-acre property in Williamsburg and Westhampton recently. When we were up there were moose tracks everywhere. Uh, this little den of coyote pups is actually in the Mineral Hills, or was in the Mineral Hills of Northampton. Naturalists went out and found them all sleeping there. So absolutely one of the natural resource values we try and protect. Uh, Drinking water quality. This obviously hits home very hard for Southampton. Clean Southampton and Easthampton in particular are known for their drinking water quality. What cleans drinking water naturally? Forests. So protecting lands and recharge areas for aquifers and around wells is critically important. Farmland. We have some of the best farmland soils in the world. Between us and the Champlain Valley, those are probably the two best places for farmland in the New England region. I guess the Quabbin area used to be as well too, but now it's underwater. But farmland is part of the heritage of the area. It's part of the economy. It's part of the scenic quality and character and quality of life of Southampton, the Pioneer Valley. We work with a lot of farmland protection with farmers in different programs. Increasingly, climate change, both mitigating through carbon sequestration and adapting. A lot of towns are really, through the MVP program, through the state, are looking at how land conservation can deal with things like flooding, deal with things like providing shady spaces in urban areas. So land is a kind of no-brainer. Conserving land is kind of a no-brainer for that. It's already functioning in that way. It's already right there. It just takes protection. So those are kind of our interests in land protection. Once we protect land, especially if we take an interest, if we take a conservation restriction in land, if we acquire it either through a donation or we purchase it, we monitor that yearly. We monitor it in perpetuity to make sure it remains protected. If we buy land, we manage that as well, often for the public and for wildlife. We have a series of kestrel boxes up as well, as our name befits, as little baby kestrel there. We have a great little conservation area right now up on Southampton Road in Westhampton, the Greenberg Conservation Area. It was a donation to us by Rebecca and Carolyn Greenberg, who are a wonderful the family in the valley. Going to be soon 70 acres, lovely place, connected to Hampshire Regional, actually. And kids from Hampshire Regional go and run on that property, and it's one of the reasons why it jumped out at us. It's kind of unconnected from everything else, but it's beautiful, and we realized, wow, this is right in the center of a community, and kids are already using it. This makes sense to protect this, so we're really happy to bring that online. We work again to connect people to the land. Obviously, one of the ways a lot of people connect to the land in the valley is through art. So we often hold workshops to get people out, plein air planing workshops and the like. And again, just getting back to that in terms of getting people out in the land and getting them engaged, I really do love this quote. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And we think that's always a really important thing to remember. When you get people out into the land and they see it and they experience it, they become attached to it, they feel the value to it. And that really helps us protect land. So a question that, again, I posed at the beginning in terms of individuals making decisions for their town and as landowners, what will Southampton and the Valley be like in 50 to 100 years? It's really up to the people in this room to make some of those decisions. So I will leave you with that and with a pretty picture and introduce some of our other speakers for the evening. So let me just grab that. So the next speaker of the night is going to be attorney Richard Evans, or Dick Evans as we know him. I have not seen Dick in a while, but we worked closely together when I was at the Trustees of Reservations. He's practiced law in the Hampshire-Franklin area for over 40 years, including the representation of land trusts and conservation-minded landowners. He is a recognized authority on Chapter 61, which is called a current use program, a tax incentive to have people keep their land open. And his office is in Northampton. He actually also lives down the road from me, which he doesn't know. But so I'm happy to invite Dick Evans to the stand. Thank you very much.
No. What you hit the date? Hit the date. That one? Okay. Yeah, go, okay. Top slide. Okay, good, thank you. And do you have a pointer? Is there a pointer? All right. Good evening. We're coming up with a big anniversary this year. Do you know what August is the anniversary of? Come on. Woodstock, exactly. It's the 50th anniversary of the American Cultural Revolution coming up. Great. Well, the Cultural Revolution brought us a lot more than sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And one of those things it brought us was a new environmental consciousness. And part of that environmental consciousness plays a huge role in the mechanisms and the approaches that we use today for the protection of land. And I'd like to tell you about some of those, and I want to start with the year 1972, which I consider right there in part of the Cultural Revolution. It was a watershed year for land conservation in Massachusetts, not only because it was the year that I moved here, and from a planet called Florida, and but it's the year that the voters of Massachusetts passed Article 97 of the Massachusetts Constitution. This was a huge, huge thing. You may have heard of Article 97. How many have heard of Article 97? A couple of people. Well, it's a very big thing. By amending the Constitution in 1972, the voters of Massachusetts declared that the people have the right to clean air and water, freedom from excessive and unnecessary noise, and the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic qualities of their environment. Now, that's like the Founding Fathers coming together and declaring that all of us have the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? Similar sort of thing. It was just declared our rights. And the second part of Article 97, it says that the protection of the people, that's very important, and their right to the conservation, development, utilization of agricultural resources and so forth, is hereby declared to be a public purpose. So, and then it goes on and gives the legislature authority to enact laws to carry out those purposes. So let's go back to that language, the protection of the people. And the protection of the people includes a number of things, but three things I'm going to mention. One thing, you may have all heard of the so-called right to farm laws. There are a number of things, various laws that come under the so-called right to farm laws, but the biggest and most important one was an addition to our zoning laws called the agricultural exemption. And what that amendment to the zoning laws says was that zoning laws cannot operate to prevent a farmer from farming, to put it shortly, briefly. And that agricultural exemption has protected farmers from being overly regulated by zoning. There are also changes to public health laws that declared that the odors and dust arising from farm operations shall not constitute a nuisance, thereby give a cause of action to a neighbor to complain. Changes to the motor vehicle laws allowing tractors to drive on public roads without a registration for a certain distance. And a couple of other things, but those are the major so-called right to farm laws. And then the one thing that the Article 97 authorized was the acquisition by the state and land trust of agricultural preservations restrictions and conservation restrictions, the things that Mark just talked about. And another thing that came to life during this period, in 1973 actually, was what we call the so-called Chapter 61 laws, which is my subject here tonight. Now, Chapter 61 laws, a word about nomenclature here. It's very unfortunate. You could say we're taxonomically challenged. There are three chapters. There's Chapter 61 of the Massachusetts General Laws, and that relates to tax breaks, which I'm going to describe for you in a minute, on forest lands. Then there's Chapter 61A of the Mass General Laws that relates to agricultural and horticultural lands, and Chapter 61B of the general laws that relates to so-called recreational land. That's sort of a catch-all category. Remember, the objective of these laws is to promote the maintenance and the preservation of open spaces. And so, as between forest lands, agricultural lands, and recreational lands, we got it pretty much all covered. Now, the best way, I think, to understand the Chapter 61 laws is to think of them as creating a contract. And maybe that's the lawyer in me, but that's how I visualize it. And a contract, of course, is an agreement between two parties. In this case, think of a contract as between a landowner and the people. Remember the people who had the right to be protected under Article 97? Well, there's the same people. That's us. So let's look at this contract from two perspectives. One's the benefits to each party and the cost to each party. Now, when you so-called put your land in chapter, or Chapter 61, and people use the term 61 or 61A, 61B, they're very similar in the way they're written and the way they operate. I've heard them called a number of different things, but I will just call them Chapter 61 laws. So what happens when the landowner puts his land in Chapter 61, and what I mean by putting in, you sign the paperwork with the assessor. Your property then is not assessed at fair market value, which the law required it to be before 61 came along. And that was the problem. Assessors were assessing property at their full and fair market value. Farmers couldn't afford to pay the taxes, and farms were going under. And we lost a lot of valuable farmland and open space. So this is one of the things that drove us, the legislature, to adopt Chapter 61 laws, was to protect farmers from the loss of having to sell their land to pay the taxes. So your land, when you're in Chapter 61, is assessed at its agriculture or horticultural value. Now, the benefits to the people are lower infrastructure costs. There's another kid that, if the houses aren't being built, then kids aren't in school and roads don't have to be plowed and such. Open spaces, retention of open spaces helps retain the character of the town, because that's very much part of the town. And the town gets the opportunity to buy the land, which we'll get to in just a second. Now, I mentioned the cost to the landowner. There's some paperwork involved. It's not too onerous. There's something called rollback and conveyance taxes, or better to think of them as penalties, because when you put your land in Chapter 61, you get this tax break. Remember, your land is assessed at horticultural, agricultural, or forest value instead of full and fair market value. But you can't just put it in and then when a good offer comes along, take it out and pocket the money. You owe the people some reimbursement there. So the longer you own the land, the longer you keep it in 61, the less the penalty. So if you take it out right away, you pay a substantial penalty. You pay the town back. In the case of 61A, in the first 5 years, you pay the town back what you would ordinarily have owed them in ordinary taxes. And given certain circumstances, you may owe this additional penalty called conveyance, a penalty or conveyance tax. I'm not going to get into the particulars right now. It's kind of complicated. But just know, as part of this contract between the landowner and the people, you're obliged to keep it in lest you incur a penalty. Taking it out prematurely, you incur a penalty. Now, another thing that the landowner gives the people when the landowner puts the land in 61 is something called the first refusal option, often called a right of first refusal. We'll get back to that in a second. Now, the cost to the town or the people is obviously less revenue and uncertainty as to the future of the property. Of course, there's no more uncertainty here about the future of the land than if it had remained in private hands. But important thing about 61A, it does not ensure perpetual protection of the land. Conservation restrictions and agricultural preservation restrictions do that, but Chapter 61 is not forever. So let's talk about this first refusal option. So first thing, I'm going to mention about three important things to know about the first refusal option. One is that it only applies when you take your land out of conservation. If you are a big landowner, your land is in conservation, you want to sell your land to someone else, they're going to keep it open, keep it, not develop it, fine, not a problem. All you have to do is give the assessor a letter saying the buyer gives the assessor a letter saying it's going to stay in conservation. So you're the landowner, your land's in 61, you get an offer to buy it from a bona fide buyer. There have been a lot of tricks. I don't have time to get into some of them now, but people have tried to work the system. And every time somebody comes up with a new trick, some developer perhaps, then the court, then there's litigation, and then the amendment in the legislature. But so you get a bona fide offer from a buyer. And what you do then is give notice to the town, formal notice to the town, and the notification requirements are a little complicated. But when you give all the formal notice to the town then has 120 days in which to step into the buyer's shoes and take over for the buyer. Or it can arrange for a land trust like Kestrel or Franklin to step in to the town's shoes and carry out the contract, consummate the contract for conservation purposes. Now, a couple of years ago, and Mark described me as an expert on 61A. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but I have given a number of talks on this subject to groups. And several years ago, I developed a flow chart that showed, in some clarity, I think, and simplicity, the precise steps that were necessary in terms of notifying the town. And I'll share that with you now. I won't bother you with it. We got better things to do tonight. But I just want to say that this is the maze that the people of Southampton faced some time ago when the Glendale Road project came up. And the townsfolk of Southampton and supported this project. The Ed Gibson, the town administrator, Renee Groden, and other officials and leaders of the town did their work magnificently, navigating that maze I just showed you, and it produced the successful project, the preservation of the land up on Glendale Road, which I'm sure the town will enjoy for many years. The town thanked them, obviously. I'm sure posterity will thank them, and I thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Attorney Evans. That was fantastic. Our next speaker tonight is a local resident, Charlotte Axtell, who is vice chair of the Southampton Conservation Commission, where she focuses on the protection of water resources and stewardship of our conservation properties in town. She's currently completing her master's in wetland hydrology at UMass and a soil scientist certification. Her thesis focuses on vernal pools, those spring pools with the salamanders. And she has also experience in wetland assessment, delineation, and restoration. So a big welcome for Charlotte.
Now we're going to see if I can figure out the technology. Oh, bear with me. That was relatively painless. Okay. Do you know which of these I clicked to make it full screen?
That's why the tech person is here.
Thank you. Oh, did I? Hi Hi, everyone. As Mark mentioned, my name is Charlotte Axthelm. I am currently a resident of Southampton, and I am a member of the Conservation Commission, but I'm not from here originally. I came here to do my undergrad at UMass, and I ended up liking it so much that I stuck around and am now finishing up my master's in wetland hydrology. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm going to talk to you folks a little bit today about something that Mark already touched on a little bit, but I will be kind of zooming in on the wetland portion of it, as that is my primary interest. So the first thing I'm going to do is essentially define for you what a wetland is. And this might seem relatively straightforward because, you know, it's a wetland. It's a place that's wet. But it's a little more complicated than that. So there's essentially three components that, as a wetland scientist, I look for in order to determine if an area is a wetland or not. And the first is, of course, hydrology. You can't have a wetland without water. So essentially the threshold for a wetland is 2 to 3 weeks of persistent inundation or saturation during the growing season. And this is kind of a weird, complex term to use, but that just means there's water at or near the surface for 2 to 3 weeks when plants are active. Beyond this threshold, though, there's a lot of variability in what we can see, particularly here in Massachusetts. So you can have everything from permanent systems like lakes and ponds to systems that are defined by being more ephemeral, like this vernal pool, which is one of my study sites, and everything in between. And one important thing to note about the hydrology of wetlands is that it is extremely dependent on seasonality. So I mentioned growing season earlier. You'll notice this picture of Whittemore Conservation Area right here in Southampton was taken during the winter. And there is surface water, but normally when plants are active instead of dormant, there won't be. So this is something that's important to think about when you're determining if an area is a wetland, and also something that makes it a little more complicated. So the hydrology is really the big controlling factor, but it also determines the other two factors that I'm going to talk about. The next being soils. So in order for a wetland to develop hydric soils, it has to be wet for long enough. And basically what we're looking at with these hydric soils is reduced low chroma matrix colors, these really gray and blue colors, as well as oxidization of iron in pores and root linings. And this is just really a demonstration that the water table is fluctuating and transporting these reduced elements. So the third factor that's controlled by hydrology is vegetation. And this is, again, because of how variable hydrology is, really variable. So you can get floating-leaved aquatic bed vegetation like water lilies. This is at Wolf Hill here in Southampton. Herbaceous vegetation like skunk cabbage and cinnamon fern, all the way up to woody vegetation, spice bush, even trees like ash and willows. So essentially, this is all to say that it's a lot more complicated than you might think it is. But luckily, as a conservation commissioner, it has been made a lot more simple by the Wetlands Protection Act. And that's really what I'm going to focus on from here on out. So the Wetlands Protection Act defines wetlands as basically 7 discrete resources, and you'll probably recognize these terms. So bank is pretty obvious, the area around any land underwater. Land subject to flooding is land that is subject to flooding. Bordering vegetated wetland, this is essentially what people think about when they're thinking of wetlands. So swamps, marshes, and bogs are contained in this. And riverfront area, which is a really significant one here in Southampton because we do have so many major watercourses like the Manhan River, Red Brook, Moose Brook. So all of that being said, Southampton has a lot of resource areas. We may only have basically 300 acres of wetlands, but we also have an extreme number of rivers and streams and several thousand acres of open water. So you can see from this map, we have a lot of really essential wetland resources that aren't strict wetlands as you might imagine them. And this is important because all of these different resource areas that I listed before perform a number of different functions and values for all of us as citizens of the town. And these range from everything from flood control and pollution prevention to, of course, wildlife habitat. And these are things that we should care about as citizens because as I mentioned before, we have a number of major rivers, so flood control is something that's really important, not only for the ecosystem, but for our infrastructure, for roads and bridges that will be affected by downstream movement of water and sediment during flood peaks. Pollution prevention, we are, as I was talking to a gentleman about earlier, we are not on a town sewer system, so we have to be really aware of the filtration of our water and how this is affected by our wetland resource areas. So all of that being said, there are unfortunately also a number of threats to resource areas here in Southampton and in all of Massachusetts. And this includes everything from nutrient loading and pollution, from people's over-fertilization of their lawns and car pollutants and road salt, especially in the winter here in New England, to increased deer pressure and invasive species. I'm sure many of you are familiar with multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet. Wetlands have additional invasive species that are similarly detrimental, like purple loosestrife and Phragmites, which form really dense monocultures and can be detrimental to the functions and values that we should be receiving from those areas. Hydrologic alteration through dams and undersized culverts can affect the way these wetlands function, and again, jeopardize our infrastructure and our land when climate change starts happening, and we're not having the same amount of protection from these wetland areas. And above all, this is really driven by development. The more buildings and roads we have in an area, the more pollutants are moving into these wetland areas, and they're becoming less able to deal with the effects. Invasive species thrive in disturbed areas. So this is something that we should be aware of as citizens of an increasingly developing town. And what we can see if we do start losing these wetland areas is an increase in sediment and water moving downstream during storms. And this is going to be affecting, again, as I mentioned before, roads and bridges. And instead of having these wetlands decreasing the flood peaks and desynchronizing flood peaks, it'll all be, moving downstream at the same time. We'll see more nutrients and pollutants moving into these areas. This can result in eutrophication and algal blooms, resulting in fish kills, particularly in areas like the Ty-Carmody Reservoir, which is a really significant resource for us. Loss of wildlife habitat and biodiversity, and reduced resiliency to climate change, which this is something that is really an important thing. This is one of my main concerns, because wetlands are responsible for the storage of 1/3 of the Earth's terrestrial carbon. So these are issues that we need to be thinking about as landowners and as citizens of the town. So I'm going in the wrong direction. So there are a number of possible solutions to these threats that I just mentioned. Wetland recreation is a big trend right now. For every area that's destroyed, a similar area or more is recreated. However, as you can see here, a recent study was done by Scott Jackson, who is a researcher at the University of Massachusetts, and that discovered that 65% of the wetland recreation projects they looked at for this study were failed. And to begin with, 12 of these projects were not even built. So this is an option, but it's not necessarily a great option. Wetland restoration is also an emerging field right now. Dam removal and culvert replacement, including here in Southampton, the Lyman Mill Pond Dam, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has been addressed by, or identified by the Department of Environmental Restoration as a potential to restore a stream ecosystem. But this is a really time-consuming process, and it's extremely expensive. So while this is a great option, it's not necessarily viable for many people. And in my opinion, the best option is simply conservation. And this doesn't necessarily mean a complete halt of development. It just means identifying the areas that are going to be the most significant to our town in the future and making sure that those are preserved. So to recap, wetlands are essential for our health and safety, and they need to be protected. And we can either spend time and money restoring areas that have been destroyed, or we can simply not destroy them in the first place. I would like to thank my lab assistant. And I was going to say I'll take questions, but I guess we're doing questions at the end.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, we're going to continue to get into the local perspective on conservation here with talking to a few local landowners who chose to conserve their land. First up is Southampton native Barry Searle, who is the owner of the Wolf Hill Sanctuary in Southampton, a 200-acre property that's managed by the town's Conservation Commission. He's the 8th generation of his family to live on this land, and I have a note here that says he also plays a mean guitar. So let's welcome Barry.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's going to be kind of weird to be up here without my crutch. I don't know how to do this. So I got asked to speak. I don't know if I can fill up 15 minutes or not, but I'll try. If you can, indulge me a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about history. I can't claim to be an expert when there's Ted Hendrick in the room, but I can tell you a little bit about my family. Nathaniel Searle was born in 1686, and he was one of the first 5 families in town. In fact, he was the 2nd signatory on the church charter here. So I'm proud to call this my church even still today. It's kind of neat. Nathaniel had 12 kids, 9 sons, and he bought out farmland for each of his sons, including one son named Zophar. That's Zophar. It's a biblical name, which happens to be the land where I live now. I was the 8th generation born onto that land, and in all those generations, there was always only ever one son to take over the farm, up until my grandfather had 2 sons, my dad, Edward, and my uncle, Myron. And my grandfather had pretty progressive ideas for his time, and he developed an apple orchard which actually shipped apples worldwide, and he kind of developed a variety called the Northern Spy, which maybe you know, and for my money it's the best apple there is, which was interesting because he married a southern girl, my grandmother Lizelle, who came from the mountains of western North Carolina, very rural, very remote. And I was largely raised by her and my grandfather because my mom worked and my dad was working, but I was instilled pretty early on to the value and the benefit of nature, wildlife, and natural land as it is having its own intrinsic value. My grandfather, as I said, had apple orchards. He had a sawmill and a large dairy herd on 300 acres there up on Russellville Road that abutted Fulmer Road. And it stayed in that use and still is today. Around the late 70s, early 80s, it became apparent that my dad and my uncle needed to divide the place. And it took a lot of years and a lot of negotiations back and forth. But around 2000, somewhere between 1998 and 2000, they reached an agreement where my uncle got the open arable land and my dad got the forested area, and which included largely Alder Pond. And we, at that time, were looking to see about getting money through the APR. We talked to Rich Hubbard at the time and a bunch of other people, and we were told you can't do an APR on wooded areas. It's only for agricultural lands, which wasn't what my dad was going to get. So that didn't really work for us at the time, but my uncle did do the APR for the open arable land, and we found out about a program called the Forest Legacy Program, which is a federal program that would have been ideal for us, and we worked through a fellow named Garrett Stover and another friend named Mark Noonan, who helped us through that application process. And unfortunately, as ideal as that would have been for us, we got shot down. It turns out that's a very competitive program, and so that didn't happen for us. So a number of years went by. I got a phone call from Mark Cassis from town here, and he was tied in with the Winding River Land Trust out of Westfield, and he asked me would we be interested in some type of conservation restriction, which was basically the same idea as the APR, where we sold out the development rights in exchange for, promising to never develop them. And that was perfect. It's just what we wanted, and the timing was good because my kids were getting to be college age. We needed some money for that, and the way we worked it was with the Southampton Conservation Commission to administer the program, as far as they're the ones that take the phone calls, and we structured it such that I still own it, and I can log it or do firewood or maple sugaring or anything like that as I need to. But it's called a de minimis revenue can only be gained from it. I couldn't open up a gravel bank there or anything like that. But they've been more than wonderful to work with, the Southampton Conservation Commission. We did a walk and a survey of where they asked me where would I envision a good hiking trail to be. And through the magic of GPS, we took a walk and figured out exactly where we wanted it to go along the water on Alder Pond to the large extent of the trail and then loop your way back out. So it's about a mile-long trail, I think, maybe a mile and a half. If you haven't been there, I'd encourage you to go check it out. The Conservation Commission also recruited volunteers to establish the trail. I didn't have to really lift a finger for that. They did all the hard work with that, and signage they took care of. The town at the time got together, the highway department made a little parking area there off of Fulmer Road, and it's not really in your face, it's subtle like we kind of wanted it to be. And they also said we could name it anything we wanted, so I thought the word sanctuary ought to be in there to really establish what our vision was for it. And that implies, in fact, no hunting there. And you can set these up any way you wish, and we still have the option. If I wanted to let somebody hunt there, I could. My family and I have talked it over, and we're really not inclined that way, but you never know. It's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. You can set these up any way you want. I don't know, I just really enjoy nothing more than going out there and cutting firewood or being in the woods, and you kind of think, what was happening here 200 years ago? Or what was these people's issues of the time or their worries of the day? And here we are 200 years later, and there's still trees growing there. I hope it continues that way. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. I just wanted to double back for a second here because I think Barry's story, illustrates some things we talked about in the beginning, and one of those is, finding the right conservation partner. The Forest Legacy program that he mentioned is actually still up and running today, and actually properties in this area are eligible for it. Again, it is a federal program, and not all federal programs like this, but it's very competitive because land here competes with projects all across the nation. So for Forest Legacy now, you need around 2,500 acres for a project of different landowners together to make it work. There are other federal programs that you don't need that much. But at the same time, it just brings up the importance of the state conservation grant programs, which Southampton has been using mostly, as well as local Community Preservation Act. The more local you get, state, municipal, I think those levels, those scales really recognize what's important in a town. So you don't have to necessarily compete with a 9,000 acre project in Utah. You know, it can be the 30-acre project in Southampton that deems important, and the state will listen to you, and hopefully, you know, you can convince your local residents in Southampton that's important to protect too. So, but we'll move on. We have another landowner up to talk with us. Next is Anthony Borton, Tony Borton, who I've known for a while and haven't seen for a bit. He's a retired professor of veterinary and animal science at UMass, correct, Tony? Was it? Exactly. He's lived in Conway, Mass, for 55 years, where he has held numerous town positions, including selectman, CPA committee, and chairman of the Open Space Committee, and he is on the board of Franklin Land Trust. So we're very happy to welcome Tony Borton. That's the one.
How do we put that in?
Here, I will let you.
Thank goodness for people who know what they're doing. Excuse me. Yep. That's what we want. Did you have a pointer or? No, okay, don't need one. Have we got one? Might help. Well, thank you very much, and been some excellent presentations here. I have to give you a disclaimer to start with, and that is to say that I'm really not a proponent of open space or conservation. I'm a fanatic about it. I think that those of you who have the opportunity, thank you, that's wonderful. Yep. Have the opportunity to protect your land, it really is an opportunity that you should consider, and you should talk with your local land trusts. If you don't have land that you want to protect, you should still talk to the local land trusts, because they're wonderful organizations. We have some great ones in the area, and I understand the Kestrel is having a membership drive at the present time, and I think accept any amount, won't you?
We will indeed.
Yes. So you should. So you should think of supporting them. It's very important, and also the Hilltown Land Trust, the Franklin Land Trust do a great job. They asked me to talk because I was involved in putting together some properties in the town of Conway. My experience, the reason I'm a fanatic about land protection is that until I was 30 years old, every place I lived was developed. I grew up in rural Virginia, Fairfax County. Now, if any of you know Fairfax County, you won't think that's rural, but it was in 1940 when I lived there. And it was still farmed with horses, and I just loved it. I rode a horse through that countryside, and it was beautiful countryside. And if you go there now, it's under the runway at Dulles International Airport. We moved to New Jersey, central New Jersey, after the war into Somerset County. In 1940, they said they had more cows than people in Somerset County. It was a great place to grow up in high school. I worked on local dairy farms. I loved agriculture. I loved the outdoors. I went off to college, came back and went to work for the Department of Agriculture for several years in the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, visiting different dairy farms in Somerset County. 37 farms a month I went to. Then I went off to graduate. I decided, that job made me decide I wanted a career in animal agriculture. I went to graduate school at Michigan State got a master's and a PhD, and then taught there for several years, and came back, and that was 7 years I was gone, and every single dairy farm was gone in 7 years. Well, fortunately, I came back to Massachusetts, and I came to the University of Massachusetts, and I bought a dairy farm, an old dairy farm, or a dairy farm from an old dairy farmer, rather. He was going out of business. That was in 1964, 112 acres up in the town of Conway. And we lived there and raised our kids there, loved it. It's beautiful land. It's got open fields, it's got streams, it's got hills. Wonderful riding, that's a lifelong interest of mine, horseback riding. And we just went along gaily till about 25 years ago, and the seed got planted. And that's what it was about, maybe we should think about conserving it. And it took a while, but we did conserve, or put a conservation restriction on our 112 acres. And that's the one that says the Borton CR there. And we thought it would be a good idea to let the neighbors know what we were doing. So we had a coffee and a dessert with our neighbors. About 15 neighbors came. And we said, you know, we're doing this conservation restriction. We're having it open to the public, but it will never be developed. And our neighborhood was all several generation families. And they were at the point where they were no longer farming, and they were wondering what they were going to do with their land. And they kind of started to fall into line. And if you don't mind my telling you a few stories about it, I think it's kind of interesting. But this property right here was on budding property, 113 acres. And that family had had it since the 40s, but they didn't live on it. It was a weekend place, and they spent the summer. It has the oldest house in Conway, 1775-year-old house. And it's a lovely piece of land. And at the time that we moved there, their kids were the same age as our kids, so our kids, we got to know the family very well. They were only there on weekends and in the summers, but their kids would come over and ride our horses and so forth. So when we decided to have this coffee, they came, and they said there were four siblings. They lived in, one lived in Colorado, and one lived in England, and another, they were all over the place, but they said, we want to save the land. And they were the first to sign up. That night, they said, yes, let's do it. Rich Hubbard from the Franklin Land Trust was there and talked to them. And we really got a good start on conserving land by this piece of property right here, which was a 200-acre farm that Fisheries and Wildlife bought to start the Polenbrook Conservation Area, or Polenbrook Wildlife Management Area. So that was the first piece of property along this road. This road starts, this is the town of Conway. It comes through the covered bridge, going right through there. I'm shaky, aren't I? That's what happens when you get to be 80 years old. It comes right through there, and this is the road that comes right down here. Most of the west side of the road is now under the control of Mass Wildlife. They have about 1,100 acres that they put together there now. But at that time, the first farm was just 200 acres. Then our place, then this place. Then this farm here was a farm that people had lived in since the 40s. But the elderly couple was getting old. One son bought an adjacent piece of land right here and built a house. And another daughter came and lived with the parents in the original house, and the third daughter lived up in Nova Scotia. So when we talked to them about protecting their land, the woman in Nova Scotia said, I don't know, I might want to come back there and so forth. We said, well, you know, as you said, you can carve out a piece where you could build a house if you want to come back. And so they finally all agreed and put 145 acres there, 40 acres from the son here. Then he picked up two other little camp properties, 20 acres each. But the big one was 330 acres here that belonged to a dairy farmer originally. He had it as a summer pasture. And for years he pastured his cows there in the summer. The old doctor in the town of Conway was Dr. Street, and his son used to work for that dairy farmer. Then he went off to college and became a businessman in Connecticut, but he was home visiting his dad, the doctor, one day, and the dairy farmer said to him, you know that pasture that up there, that summer pasture of mine, would you want to buy it? And he thought, well, gosh. He says, I'll sell it to you for $7.50 an acre. I said, sold. The farmer went home and told his wife that he'd sold the summer pasture for $7.50 an acre. She said, are you crazy? Are you crazy? He said, wait a minute. I only paid $7 an acre for it. Anyhow, that stayed in the family, and they used to come up and camp there, but it wasn't used regularly. But the owner's son used to come up and camp there, and he ended up going to UMass. And I used to ride horseback through there, and I'd run into him when he was camping, and we'd chat and so forth, and he liked the land. And he was a hotel and restaurant major at UMass, but he liked horses, so he took a course in horse management with me, and I think we rode together a couple of times. Anyhow, he went to Maine, started a couple of restaurants in Portland, very successful. And he couldn't come to my coffee, but he called me while we were having it, and he said, you know, I'll come down and talk to you about that. And he came down and he talked about it, and he said, yeah, I want the family in the future to be able to come there. 330 acres on that one. And then down here, am I boring you with these stories? Because it's kind of interesting how it happens. Down here, when this family up here, their daughter went to Putney School up in Vermont. And she had a couple of classmates that she'd bring home during the holidays because they lived in Colorado and Nebraska or something like that. And so they got familiar with this area, and they were a boy and a girl, boyfriend and girlfriend. They went off to college, different colleges, but they came back and they got married, and because they liked this area so much, they bought this piece of property right here and built a log cabin and talked to them about wanting to protect it, but they couldn't. He was a geologist and she was a botanist, and they couldn't find a position in the area, so they went to Alaska, and had very successful careers in Alaska. But they kept this property, and it's so dear to their heart that when I wrote them a letter and said, would you be interested in protecting it? They said, oh yeah, and found out that they were on the land trust of Fairbanks, Alaska. And so this property they come to in the winter for their summer vacations. And they picked up another little piece over here. So they have 80 acres. And this one just closed in the last year. And I had nothing to do with that one. So that just happened that it come. But anyhow, there are a couple of points I want to make is, one, the people have to have a real connection with the land. They have to love the land. And if they love the land, they're easy to talk to and convince that, you know, you ought to really think about protecting that land. And it really helped, I think, that we had a real sense of community, and I knew them well, and I liked them, and they liked me, and so it pays to get out and talk to people. And don't be shy about protecting the land, because if they love it, it's something they would really like to see happen. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. So for our last presenter of the evening, we have Michael Rosenberg, one person I don't know and haven't met yet, sorry about that, who works as a construction project designer and manager in both the private and municipal sector. He is a former chair of the Southampton Finance Committee and now the chair of the town's Master Plan Implementation Committee, which he joined to help continue what he started a few years ago and to learn more about the town where he and his family live. So, Michael, welcome.
I have a jump drive. Again, but I don't know what I can unplug. So I didn't know the background on the original PowerPoint presentation, but we matched accidentally. Good evening. My name is Michael Rosenberg. I am the chair of the Master Plan Implementation Committee. I am not a wetland scientist or an open space professional. I'm here to kind of talk about the master plan and how it relates to what we're talking about this evening. So that's a little smaller than expected. But this vision comes from the master plan, and I underlined and italicized some words that I thought really stood out when you think about what we're here for today, or the topic of the subject, or the topic of the presentations. The people of Southampton, this is directly from the master plan, support economic growth that enhances Southampton's character, fairly balances community service, capacities, and impacts. Support new development and redevelopment that are in harmony with natural resources, the environment, community values, and likely future needs, and are focused in priority areas identified by the community. Are dedicated to preserving open space for agricultural, forests, parks, and recreation in accordance with the Open Space and Recreation Plan. Want to ensure that important historic features of Southampton are preserved and maintained. Value the conscientious maintenance of common community infrastructure assets such as roads, trails, town buildings, vehicles, water supply, and treatment. The library, schools, and other municipal properties and facilities. Are committed to supporting Southampton's children through quality education and educational resources, support quality, value, and efficiency in public service, support a variety of housing options that meet Southampton's needs, want to ensure that the next generation of residents is able to enjoy a community that is even better than the Southampton of today. The master plan has been produced to help achieve this vision of the community for the future. So, the master plan it started a decade ago, right? They had vision exercises, surveys. They had a committee that developed the master plan with the PVPC. It kind of went dormant for a few years. So the select board has appointed a group, the Master Plan Implementation Committee, to help revitalize that, to status it, and to hopefully move forward with the number of strategies. There are, we'll call it 100 strategies in this master plan, broken out over about 9 chapters. What's the next button here? Here are the 9 chapters. I'm not going to read all this, but chapter 1, demographics and housing. 2, economic development. 3, historic and cultural resources. 4, the big one, open space. 5, mobility. 6, public service and facilities. 7, energy. 8, land use. Chapter 9 is the implementation. So the master plan is a 200-page document, like I said, 9 chapters. It is a great resource for information on the town, information on where we are, where we were. Some of the challenges with the plan that we found is the amount of data. It's 200 pages. There's 100 strategies to implement across 8 different sectors of the town, and we're not the group that developed the plan. So we've played catch up for about 4 months. It's taken us to go through it because we meet once a month, maybe twice a month. The other challenge we've come with is the statistics. So they're older. You know, the plan was put together 5 years ago. Those statistics weren't all up to date at the time, so those could have been a few years old. So some of the numbers and the figures could be 8 years old or more. So it doesn't necessarily show the exact picture today. Chapter 4, open space and recreation. So one thing we found while going through the master plan, and this was actually before we even knew about this presentation, we found that chapter 4 was central to the document. There are 8 chapters, but every little chapter had something that led back to chapter 4, along with chapter 9. Obviously, land use is very similar to this. But we just found that everything led back to chapter 4. Chapter 4 took us the longest to get through. I think it's one of the more complicated chapters, and how do we preserve the land. So open space and recreation. The preservation and stewardship of open space and natural resources are among the most important elements of the community vision expressed by residents of Southampton. During the Southampton 2030 visioning process, residents said they appreciate the town's clean air and water, abundant woods, wildlife, conservation areas, trails, and outdoor opportunities. When asked to name their concerns about the future, many residents said new residential developments and the loss of active farms are among the greatest threats to Southampton's current culture. So past survey results. The general consensus, residents would like Southampton to remain a rural town. 82% were in support of farms, open space, and passive recreation. 69% in support of bike and walking trails connecting neighborhoods and open space. 75% in support of zoning for agriculture or low-density development with a 5-acre minimum. So in certain areas, if you'd like to build a home, you're required more acreage than, let's say, down the road here. 75% in support of permanently protecting land. Let's see. So resources. The chapter focuses on some, I guess, main resources in town, right? Watersheds and water resources, Ty-Carmody Reservoir and Barnes Aquifer. Southampton has adopted an overlay water supply protection district that limits development within the primary recharge areas of groundwater aquifers. It encompasses about 9,465 acres in Southampton. One of the things we found alarming or intriguing was, is this something that is part of the zoning and building process in town, right? Do people in town actually know about the overlay district when you're going to build a home? Do the regulatory agencies in town know? Because there are people that you could ask that don't know. The other one here, Barnes Aquifer Protection Advisory Committee, or BAPAC. I think the jury is still out on whether or not this is a thing anymore, or it's not a thing. Not a thing. So BAPAC served as a advisory board for developments that were in and around the Barnes Aquifer protection, or Barnes Aquifer. If you were going to put in some sort of subdivision, they would provide some sort of written documentation advising for or against some of those issues. Without them there, who is really reviewing these, right? Who is putting their nose into the paperwork and seeing what is and isn't going to be good for the aquifer? Another resource talked about a lot, forests and wildlife. Forests occupy 13,000 acres of total land in Southampton. Another interesting fact, there are 31 miles of unofficial trails and old roads for possible recreational opportunities, which I thought was great. My wife and I, we hike. Our son is just old enough to walk a little and then be carried, so that's interesting to us. The sanctuary that was discussed before, like, we will go walk that soon, as long as it's warm. But it's great to know about these things, great to have this in your backyard. Farmland, 3,200 acres of prime farmland soils and 5,300 acres of state and locally important farmland soils. Now some of these statistics, like I said, are dated. These numbers could be less, right? If something has been sold or repurposed in the last 10 years, these numbers could be less. And then they talk about recreation, and they talk about thinking beyond active recreation, not just baseball and soccer. And there's nothing against those, but passive recreation, hiking, walking, maybe low impact fishing, those types of things, right? How do you promote those resources in town? How do you make the residents aware of those? All right, so this is a slide. It's a little tough to see. We actually met Monday. We talked about this a lot. So this slide shows focus areas for sort of planning. So rural, I guess you'd say rural urban planning, areas in town where, it's asking me for updates. Remind me later. So it gives planning focuses area, which are on Route 10, right? Where does the town see some sort of development or re-engagement of what's there, repurposing of some facilities, and it also goes into open space protection areas, so the OS 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Sure. So, like I said, open space, so 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then it talked about planning areas, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, the important thing that we've kind of been discussing a lot lately in the master plan is how do you connect the open space with the planning space, right? How do you get trails, whether it's hiking trails, rail trails, sidewalks? How do you make your open space accessible? And how do you do that in an orderly fashion? How do you plan for that? So I have some other slides, which are a little tough to see and tough to read. I'll just kind of outline these. So this is the protected open space areas in town. So green is protected, blue is water. I can't read what the red is. I think those might be dams, I think. But so these coincide with the open space areas on the previous slide, right? Outlining those. Next, we had another image from the report. Christina, I did cross off vacant. I know you took exception to that. We had a discussion about vacant developable land, right? Just because it's a forest and nobody has a house there doesn't mean it's just vacant. So that's off the slide. So developable and undevelopable land, it's just another great slide. And I apologize that these are hard to see. They're small in the plan, so they're smaller here. But there's great information in here. It shows how the town is linked together through some of the resource areas, through the roads and the trails and the properties. And honestly, you should read the master plan. It's available on the website. It's only 200 plus pages, but it's really informative, especially for what we talk about and what everyone's talked about today, because every chapter relates to everything in there. Prime farm soils and active agriculture. Another good slide, does show the active farms from maybe it's 2006. And then the areas with prime farm soil. So it relates back to everything, right, we've been talking about today. It's kind of a visual for this. Like I said, the images are tough to see, but going through the plan, looking at what's in there, it's very important, and it's great information. These are our strategies, and I'm not going to read these strategies, because this is only the first page of them. Chapter 4. This is the second page of the strategies. So every one of these strategies has groups that are tied to it. So the planning board, the conservation commission, the zoning board, the select board, the town administrator, there are lots of responsible parties. And if you participate in any of those committees, once again, I would recommend reading the master plan, because in about a month, we'll be divvying up the chapters, we'll be divvying up the departments, and we will be doing an outreach to all departments to kind of get a status of the strategy and to try to get a timeline for how do we move this strategy forward, how do we implement these processes, how do we continue to make good progress with this plan. I mean, there are, surprisingly, for something that has been dormant for years, there are a decent amount of complete items on here, but we want to complete more, and I think it's important for the town to continue when they started. I mean, the plan was developed sort of by majority survey results, majority rule, and it's good stuff. It's good stuff to do for the town. It kind of guides the development of the town, right? It talks about where a sidewalk should be and why that sidewalk should be there, and that sidewalk is going to bring you to an open space recreation area, so you don't have to drive your car to go take a hike, right? You can safely travel the sidewalk, walk somewhere, enjoy some outdoor time. So my last slide, what do you want for Southampton? So like I said, we will be doing an outreach to the committees, the commissions, the groups that are involved. If you have a different opinion, if you have a suggestion, if maybe you've read the master plan and you have ideas on some of the strategies, just write down that email and send an email. It can be anonymous. It can be, if you want to come sit in on a meeting, if you want to sit down and talk about it. Talk about some of the things. Maybe you were a part of the master plan committee in the beginning, but we're interested in feedback. We're interested in helping to move things forward. And if you have information that helps, we'd appreciate it. That's all I have. I don't know if I should. Do I entertain questions now or? Perfect. Thank you.
We had originally had one other speaker who planned to present tonight, Lincoln Fish, a really great forester at Bay State Forestry. He wasn't able to join us. He unfortunately took ill. Hopefully maybe we'll hear from him again. He was going to speak about basically management options for landowners for forests to achieve certain goals. He's really a great guy, so again, hopefully he can come out soon. Again, this was the first of 2 roundtables. I'll be speaking again, getting more in depth about a land conservation project and what that entails, rather than kind of the 40,000 feet that I gave you tonight. I want to mention I made some maps for tonight's presentation, which we didn't have a place to lay them out. You can look at them a bit afterwards, and I will put them in the town hall, and we'll figure out where they're going to go. They map out some various things, Chapter 61 land. We think we have prime forest soils on there. We have water resources, mainly the Barnes Aquifer Recharge Area just mapped out. It's all public information from Mass GIS, but we just put it on a big map so people can actually look at it. So before we go into the question and answer period, I just wanted to thank you all again, and hopefully you all learned something tonight. Some of the basics about conservation, why landowners might want to consider conservation, why municipalities might want to consider conservation, and why land trusts might want to consider conservation, and how we start balancing that out and kind of narrowing down what areas are really most important and what resources are most important to protect. Obviously, these are towns we're talking about. The other question I was going to ask is, raise your hand if you live in a house, and I'm sure all hands would go up. Obviously, people need places to live. And towns are making hopefully smart choices about where development's going to go, where it's really going to be encouraged, and where limited resources towards conservation can be focused in terms of what are the most important resources a town would want to protect. So with that, I don't know how you want to do this. You want to call up all the speakers, and people are going to collect questions.
Okay, what if a family puts land in Chapter 61, but then wants their children to be able to build a home on the land? You're in luck, because there is an exception in the actual statute that allows a landowner to use the land for a residence for the owner or a parent, grandparent, child, grandchild, brother or sister of the owner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're in luck there. Next question, Mark.
I think that might be all the Chapter 61 question. Oh, is this?
We know Chapter 61 is manipulated statewide and is taking tax revenue from towns. What is being done to address issues? Well, certainly the purpose of Chapter 61 is to take revenue from towns. That's the way it works. But when the town loses revenue, it gains the benefit of the open space and the infrastructure savings. So what is being done to address issues? I'm not aware that there's any movement right now on Beacon Hill to change Chapter 61 or reform it. There have been steps from time to time over the years, but I'm not aware of anything going on right now. Mark, are you aware?
Well, I think it might be people gaming the system. Is there anything that might be part of the question? Is there any, in terms of, is there any working to address that? Loopholes?
Yeah. Well, that's as I mentioned earlier. People find loopholes in this, and sometimes they get away with them, and sometimes they don't. But typically, if there's litigation, then there are reforms, legislative reforms to the chapter. There have been a lot of tweaks to it over the years. So yes, people find loopholes. Okay. Other questions about anything?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a couple more.
Okay.
And I'll hand them out. There's a good diversity of questions so far. This one I can answer. When conserving land in a land trust, does it become public access, or do you have a choice? Excellent question. And I think the answer is it depends. And the depends part really comes from where the funding comes from, if funding or is involved. If you're going for certain state grants to provide funding to purchase the conservation restriction, there are some state grants that do require public access. Now, what that means can often be negotiated. Does that mean allowing hunters on during hunting season? Does it mean allowing a trail that currently crosses through the property to continue going through the property? There are certainly other ways. I mean, with a lot of donations of CRs, and some grants that don't require public access. So again, that's one of the issues that is absolutely great to think of, if you're considering conservation, to bring up when you're talking with a land trust and say, this is one of the concerns we have. It's one of many things that you need to think through, and I always bring this up with landowners when they're talking about land conservation that is in perpetuity. You really have to think far out into the future, especially if you're talking about a conservation restriction and you're going to keep owning the land, because it's going to control not only it's going to control what every other landowner after you does. So you really have to sit and think, how do I want to use my land in the future, and make sure that you take that into account in the conservation restriction. So in our next presentation, I'll get into that a little bit more and some of the discussions. There is luckily a lot of flexibility there, so it's just really having the conversation and thinking about it. Okay, a couple other questions here. We have one that's kind of cryptic, but I wonder if Michael can talk about it. It just says Hampton Ponds Recreation Area, and it has your name on it. If someone wrote that and wants to
Sure. What's the question?
What are you going to do with it? You've owned it for 30 or 40 years.
Well, I've only been alive for 34, so I haven't owned it for 40. Yep. So that is part of the master plan. There is sir, we were just appointed 4 months ago. I mean, I can't speak for what's happened between the date it was published and today, but it's something we are looking at. We are addressing the strategies, chapters 1 through 8, and trying to push some of these forward. That is brought up in there as I want to say they talk about a boat launch and a swimming area and incorporating something into that area.
It's a beautiful piece of property.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, we'll make note of it. We'll make note of it in the chapter, and when we sort of get to that group, when we get to those committees to talk to them about it, we can bring it up and see what we can do.
That's great input, and I think it's the kind of input that communities need to hear. You residents, I mean, you know the resources in town and what you want to see, and luckily, we live in a society where there are mechanisms where you're allowed to come and have your voices heard and tell your town what you want to do. So hopefully things like that can end up in master plans and open space plans. The next question, I don't know if anyone up here is going to know this, and I don't know whether it's appropriate, if anyone wants to talk about it now, or if someone wants to answer it and raise their hand and talk about it after. But the question is, what is the status of the railway walking and biking corridor through Southampton? Does anyone feel they can speak to that or want to speak to that after the meeting in an individual basis? Anyone?
That is integral to chapter 4 in there.
Do you want to?
I can't speak to the status, but the walking trail utilization of the rail trail is it's integral in a lot of chapters in the master plan. So if and when we know statuses, or if and when we know progress, it'd be good to know, because there are strategies that address the rail trail and other strategies that want to connect to the rail trail at different locations. So go north and south and then have spurs east and west going in different directions. So I don't have an answer, but we would love an answer, or love some information on that. So we can address some of those strategies. Yeah, John Martin said that they will, I guess, reconvene and talk about it at a select board meeting? Okay, so the topic will be brought up as a select board agenda item.
Do we have any other index cards? No. Questions, not just index cards. I could get blank ones and make things up if you'd like, but. Well, I guess, we still technically have around 10 minutes. Are there any other questions that people just want to ask? The Northern Spy apple. I've seen it on a poster of heirloom apples. I'm interested.
Yeah, you can get them, I think Bashistas have them, and Outlook Farm has them too. They're great. They're the best pie apple going.
Bashistas and Outlook for Northern Spy apples. That's the answer there. Maureen Groden in the back. Alder Pond, yes.
Well, that just has to do with the alder bushes that were there at one time. And Wolf Hill, by the way, was so named because allegedly Zophyr Searle shot a wolf from the back of it, horseback, back in the day, in 1734. So.
Ironically, the property that Kestrel recently just purchased up on the border of Westhampton and Williamsburg is called Old Wolf Hill, so maybe our wolves were related. Christina.
Mr. Borton worked with his neighbors to form a large block, and I believe my understanding is that if landowners with contiguous properties can come together and put together a large enough block, and I don't know the acreage, that there's a different avenue for preservation. Am I on the right track there?
It's certainly, yes, there's a couple answers to that. Number one, it can potentially give you leverage when going for a grant application, especially if some of those properties were going to, have a donated conservation restriction or, a donation of land. That could certainly, rank the application a little higher. I'm thinking mostly about state grants. One of the tricky things is most state grants only allow for one landowner, and a lot of the state grants actually, it's the municipality who's applying. There are a few state grants where a land trust or a private organization can apply. One is called a conservation partnership. The land grant, the drinking water grant, the park grant, those are all municipal grants, grants where towns take the lead and apply. Land trusts can help them certainly, and we can function in various ways, but that usually only allows one landowner. But again, if there's other landowners involved, you can come up with a long-term plan and say, well, eventually we're hoping to protect this much, or there's going to be a donation of a conservation restriction in association with this, and it can make it rank higher. There is one other state grant. Number one, there's the federal grant, the Forest Legacy Program, which was mentioned already, where you need a lot of acreage. There is another state grant called the Landscape Partnership Grant, where you can have multiple landowners. You basically have to get a block of 500 contiguous acres to make that happen. You can go over that. We have used this grant. We try and get it every year. Actually, the property I just mentioned in Williamsburg, Westhampton, was a partnership of many different groups and 7 different properties. We protected just under 1,000 acres in that area alone. It's a huge forested area. So you can pool people together for that grant. And I forget what the cap is, but it's you're talking just over $1 million basically that you could get from the state from that grant, I believe. Or actually, you get around 700,000 to 800,000, and you match it locally. But that is one grant where if you can pool together that many landowners, you can get them all funded, if they're looking for funding. In that grant, we also had a few landowners who donated conservation restrictions, and that counts as match. It's getting, kind of into the weeds of land conservation financing, which we can talk about a bit, maybe at the next presentation. But yes, so there are advantages to pooling landowners together. And again, I think as a couple people have said here, land conservation takes time. And that's okay to let projects develop over time. You can do it landowner by landowner if people are interested and kind of figure out, well, who should go first and come up with a plan and kind of work it out that way. There's no rules kind of against that. It'd actually be very nice to have a plan knowing, these 3 landowners want to protect their land and we're going to apply for a grant here, this year, then this is going to be a donation and put together a nice project. I think it'd be a wonderful community effort.
Can you say the name of that partnership, the full name?
Landscape Partnership, the Landscape Partnership Grant. Yeah, and I think
So in one by one into conservation, one by one, or do they?
Landscape Partnership, it's there's no limit to the number of parcels going in, and as they close, again, these are real estate transactions, so they close in the order of when the landowner is ready and you can put everything together. We just got another Landscape Partnership grant on the Mount Holyoke Range. I forget how many properties are involved. Town of Hadley is involved, number of individual landowners. One of the nice things actually is, so like I said, you need to have 500 acres contiguous. They can connect through already protected land, though. This is why mapping gets really important. I was showing some maps before. So if you have, an already protected area and you have a landowner with 100 acres over here and another with 200 here, you can link them all up to get that 500-acre core. So again, these are things that we get, in the land trust community. This is where we get nerdy in the land conservation world and knowing all these very specific requirements for the different grants. But yeah, Landscape Partnership is great. It's for, we call, when you get into that number of acres, we call it landscape scale conservation, where you're really looking at a whole area that has important conservation values and finding as many landowners as you can. Anyone else? John?
There was mentioned before about invasive vegetation.
Invasive vegetation?
Yes, is there some program that the state has to eradicate the vegetation? I have an endangered bittersweet.
There are. Does anyone want to speak to, I know there are programs. Barry? Yeah, unfortunately, the other speaker was supposed to be here, the forester. Lincoln Fish knows, he's an expert on eradication. And I would suggest you call him. We can give you his just name if you want to come up to us afterwards, and the name of his forestry firm, and I'm sure he'd just be willing to talk with you and let you know. I know there are state programs, the EQIP program. I have not applied to it yet, but there is often money for that. There are certainly people who will do it, and using any variety of techniques, and a lot of them, including Lincoln, are quite good. So happy to talk with you about that. Oh. What was that? Which one? There's 4 names. Excellent. Well, okay. Well, we have a card here with 4 names: Jim Brooks, Ted Kennedy, who I know.
Actually did this stuff for a tax deduction.
Yep.
It was the most important in Capitol Hill and Beacon Hill.
Excellent, excellent. And we have some really good reps who are very supportive from all sides of the aisle.
He should have mentioned Jim Brooks.
Well, a lot of people have been mentioned. Terry Blunt, I certainly know. Valley Land Fund, yes. Yep. We actually merged with Kestrel Land Trust. Actually merged with Valley Land Fund. That's how we expanded back in 2011, or one of the times that we expanded. So, Hazel Young, you care to?
Most important person in this town. She's gone now, but
Former Conservation Commissioner. Good to know our history. Absolutely.
Jim Brooks was the first in the United States.
Excellent. Anyone else have anything to add? Again, I think we'll be here for a little bit. I have a couple of versions of my cards still available. I'm getting them reprinted, but happy to share those. The evaluation, yes, thank you. And again, thank you to everyone for coming out, and thank you for everyone who put it together and our presenters.